Well, welcome everybody to this webinar on financial sustainability. I'm John Gill, I'm editor of THE, and it's my great privilege to be hosting this fantastic discussion when we will be looking at the themes of a report published today by THE and EY, which asks in its title a question: how are you balancing the books for a digital future? And that's a question that combines two of the biggest issues currently facing universities: the increasingly fraught question of funding and cost control, which is a pressure point everywhere, and the mixture of uncertainty about exactly how rapid technological developments will affect universities, coupled with the absolute certainty that they will continue to impact them very significantly indeed. This report, which will be made available to all of you as webinar registrants a little later, explores these issues in four major higher education systems: the UK, the US, Canada, and Australia. And it draws on in-depth interviews with 11 university leaders, two of whom are joining us for this discussion today. Now, as you'd expect, the exact pattern of revenue and cost pressures varies between countries, but the overall picture is remarkably consistent. Outside of the elites, which are somewhat insulated, most mid-tier universities are feeling financial pressures from reduced funding, rising costs, and of course, the need to digitally transform to meet future student needs. In many cases, there are also complex political issues to navigate, whether that's about formal reviews of public funding, as in Australia, attitudes to online delivery of teaching and learning, or demands to tighten rules around student visas, which I think is a prospect that universities in the UK, Canada, and Australia in particular view with something approaching terror. So there's lots to concern universities. But this report and the discussion that we're about to have also aims to address what institutions can do to mitigate those challenges and to make the most of the opportunities that exist at a time of change. You may have noted that the title of the webinar is Radically Rethinking Approaches to Financial Sustainability. So I'm personally keen to hear a little bit more about that first word, radical, and ask our panelists to consider three questions. Do universities need to be radical? Are they capable of being radical? And will the systems in which they operate, particularly publicly funded systems, ever let them be radical? Perhaps we can come on to that. But let me first introduce this panel to you. Diana Beach is CEO of London Higher and also has past experience of working in government as a policy advisor to several UK university ministers. Dan Greenstein is Chancellor of Pennsylvania State System of Higher Education. Matt Robb is partner at EY Parthenon, and Student Schaefer is Vice President and Senior Credit Officer at Moody's Investors Service. Thanks so much to all of you for joining us. We're going to start the discussion with Susan, who's going to offer a view of the landscape and general trends from a Moody's perspective. So Susan, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, John, and welcome everyone. Just a little bit of background. I have worked at Moody's for about 10 years. Prior to that, worked in two private research universities in the United States, excuse me, and in economic development for the state of New York as well. So at Moody's, our higher education group rates about 450 public and private universities in the United States and about 40 or so outside the United States, Singapore, UK, Canada, Australia, and then one in Mexico, because I looked at our audience and realized a lot of the attendees today are from those places. So thanks for joining. So I'm going to talk about our outlook right now, some of the reasons for that outlook, what has happened over the past couple of years, what we're thinking is going to happen over the next, the rest of this year into the beginning of next year, before our panelists, get into some of the more specifics. So Moody's every year toward the end of the calendar year publishes an outlook for each sector of what we think credit conditions for that sector will be over the course of the next 12-ish months. Surprisingly, higher education was stable through the end of last year, and that was it had been negative back and forth over time, and was certainly negative at the beginning of the pandemic, but all of the government support here in the US that was really extraordinary support during the pandemic very much helped the sector. I know that wasn't, that outside the US, there is already a lot of government support that didn't have, so that impact was a little different. But that, the government support really, helped places fill large budget gaps during the pandemic and to get through such a difficult time. Why did we move to negative last year? Well, a few things. First, John just asked the question of, can you be radical in higher education? And typically, and having worked for, close to 20 years in higher education, I would not necessarily have said so, at least not on a large scale. But during the pandemic, this sector that is not known for being nimble was extraordinarily nimble. Surprisingly so to probably to certainly to us at Moody's, because we had moved to negative fairly quickly, but to schools themselves. And it was amazing to see how quickly places just turned on a dime, moved online. Professors who would probably have never considered doing an online course were all of a sudden, full steam ahead with that. And it was quite amazing to see this government support coming in, filled budget gaps so that a lot of places that would have had, really significant deficits were coming close to break even. And, it's not that necessarily, the US government was perfect in giving the right amount of money to fill those gaps, but that, credit goes to college and university business officers for adjusting budgets. And so there was a lot of belt tightening, a lot of rethinking of programs, of, positions, of where is there some bloat, where have things perhaps grown more than they need to be? Where do we need to redirect skills and resources to get us through this difficult period? And then, emerging from it, students come back to campus and, things look, people are excited, things are feeling, back to normal-ish. And then the sector is just really hit with two huge issues. One is that after furloughs, after moving a lot of people off campus, everyone is back. You need to rehire people. The job market is extraordinarily strong. And so you've got to pay, top dollar for a lot of, for people. It's hard finding people for certain sectors or certain parts of higher ed, finance, information technology, student service roles. And I know that here in the US, we may provide a bit more of, hands-on attention to students during their university experience. And those jobs can be hard to fill because people didn't necessarily want to start coming back to campus every day. And after a very stressful period, didn't necessarily want to be, counseling, coaching. Students needed more support than ever after being in a Zoom world for years, needed more support than schools necessarily had the resources to manage that. In addition to that, inflation has just been terribly high and, maybe abating, maybe not abating. That's, we talk about this constantly at Moody's, and at least in higher education, even if it abates, it takes a little while. If inflation and reports show that it's dropping, a certain percentage here and there in higher education, you're planning on an annual cycle. So you're already spending money for things you're going to need, months down the road. So it doesn't necessarily, kick in with relief immediately if things start getting better. And then, here in the US, we have some government issues right now with the debt ceiling question and some, concerns about what really is going to happen with our economy. And that certainly, impacts a lot of the countries that I know are represented on this call. So, after things looked surprisingly stable in terms of financial performance during the pandemic, things this year, just 23 is tough. 24 looks like it's going to continue to be tough. I can't tell you how many universities I speak with that say we're looking at a 1 year, a 2 year, a 3 year budget deficit. It's going to take us a couple of years to get back to equilibrium. And in their plans for getting back to equilibrium sometimes include things that seem very realistic and logical, and sometimes include things that don't sound a lot different than what lots of other schools are saying, trying to build revenue in ways that are probably less likely to be successful, and have already had so many expense cuts that there aren't a lot of places that they can cut because expenses are really going up. So there are some challenges out there. I don't want to make it sound like everything is terrible, because that's not the case at all. Overall, higher education credit quality still remains, quite strong. There still is strong demand for higher education, maybe a little wobbly in parts of the sector. We'll see what happens with unemployment. High unemployment tends to be good for higher education. And, out of the whole sector, I'd say 20% are just, doing remarkably well. Large, strong, wealthy institutions, the leading places in all of the countries represented on this call, they didn't miss a beat during the pandemic. I'd say at least half of the sector is doing, okay, being forced to make some difficult changes, but able to do that. And another 20 to 30% was already struggling, and post-pandemic is just going to struggle even more. And I think that's kind of part of what we'll be talking about today.
Susan, thank you very much for that overview. I think that sets the conversation up very nicely indeed. Just a very quick bit of housekeeping. You can ask questions if you want to in the Q&A functionality on Zoom. I see a couple of people have already asked a question, one of which is, will you be getting a recording of this after the event? You will, so we'll make sure that we get that to all of you. Now, the way I'd like to structure this conversation is to split it into three. So the first section, we're going to talk about the risks that universities are facing currently. Then we'll move on to the actions that are being taken currently to respond to those risks. And finally, we'll look at sort of future strategies and how radical universities might want to be. But I'd like to kick off with the challenges, the financial challenges and risks that are currently being faced. And obviously, these are very intertwined, many of them sort of interdependent. But Matt, let me start with you, since you were heavily involved in writing this report, and ask you to give us a view of what you think the sort of biggest risks that your analysis uncovered currently are.
Yeah, thank you. So it does vary a little bit by country, but very broadly speaking, the HE sector globally is facing some longer term challenges and some shorter term challenges. In the long term challenges, you've got this kind of rising participation taking place almost everywhere. And that on its own is a good thing, but it immediately opens up the question of how to pay for it. And then that takes you down something that looks and feels like a bit more like a market-based approach. And it's that market-based approach now and much greater competitive intensity that means that there are some winners and inevitably there are going to be some losers. So the first big challenge, if you like, is how do we pay for higher education? And the second one is how do you compete? And in most of these markets now, competition has now been running long enough that the winners are continuing to do well, but there are years of structural losses or losses of market share affecting those institutions that are not winning. The next big thing is, as we discussed, digital transformation. It's quite unusual to go through a marketization and digital transformation at the same time. Quite hard to find another sector that did that, partly because marketization has already taken place in most of the sectors. And so to get the kind of twin competitive cost and digitalization at the same time is placing unusual stress on HE. And then, of course, there are some of the shorter term things that Susan referred to, like inflation, some regulatory changes. Regulatory changes, of course, can last for quite a long time. I was saying with some of the investors with whom I work in the education sector that government policy can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent. And that is also part, I think, of the landscape facing higher education.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, and there, I mean, if we come to Diana now and look at the UK context, there is something irrational about a public funding system that's really untenable at the moment. Inflation has eroded the frozen tuition fee that covers domestic students here in the UK to such an extent that really domestic students are sort of on the cusp of being loss-making for many universities. Give us a view from London and the UK, Diana, about that perhaps and the other issues that you see.
Yeah, thank you, John. And it's quite daunting to be following the financial experts, actually, but I think it flows quite well, because I think what I want to raise is some of the biggest risks to financial sustainability of institutions at the moment, and not just financial, but actually come from disjointed or ill thought out policymaking, or indeed, as you've just suggested, policymaking that's too little too late. And we're seeing that with effectively frozen fees here in England, and I am speaking about England rather than the UK at the moment. That's basically seeing the real terms value of those fees at £6,600 at the moment, not the sticker price of £9,250. And Susan alluded to it earlier, we've got rising inflation at the moment as well, so that the value of those fees are only going to go down. So I think it's no surprise at the moment that universities are turning towards international students. That is particularly the case in London. There is a report out today by HEPI and Universities UK International that shows that 1 in 4 students now in London are international students. which is absolutely great to celebrate the diversity and the vibrancy of our campuses. But it's also a ticking time bomb when it comes to how we fund our institutions. And in London in particular, seeing you asked, and I couldn't sit here as CEO of London Higher and not reference the loss of the London Waiting in London, which was a premium which was given to London universities, but taken away from them, £64 million overnight a couple of years ago, just before the cost of living crisis as well. And what this basically did is put London universities on a precipice going into a cost of living crisis, and they had to make do with do a lot more with much less. And there's also the disjointed nature of policy making as well. I mean, that was irrational. It went contrary to evidence that London is the most expensive place to operate, but there's a disjointedness of policy as well, because on the one hand, you've got certain sectors and industries crying out for nurses, more doctors. You've got the government granting medical schools, but then you've got no subsidised healthcare places. So they have no choice but to take international students. At the moment, I think the government's failing to see things in the round, and I think this is where things are going to fall between the cracks.
I'd like to cross the pond in a minute and come to you, Dan, but before I do, just sticking with the UK, I mean, the report has lots of fascinating case studies and facts and figures. One that jumped out at me was that it's actually a couple of years old, but the National Audit Office report taking data from 2020-21, which found that 33 institutions in the UK were found to have liquidity below 30 days or forecasting that they would have before the end of the year. We've also seen a very high profile example recently in the University of East Anglia getting into financial difficulties that required sort of a crisis response and a change of leadership. Are we going to see more of that, Diana and Matt? How serious is the crisis that universities are in currently?
Thank you, Diana. I think it is very serious for some institutions. I mean, the most active part of EY path, and I'm working with universities right now, is that restructuring business, working with the banks to try to find financial solutions. There are two reasons for that. One is the confluence of factors that we've already talked about, and the other leading into this question of, can universities change? Like, yes, but only when the burning platform is almost at the kind of end of the ashes. And so universities are kind of taking the right steps very, very late. And as Dan wisely observes in the report, if you're going to pivot, you're much better to do it when you've got some dollars in the bank. So yes, universities are going to continue to be in trouble. Not everyone. There are definitely winners alongside the losers, but it is extremely likely that there will be continued universities going through severe financial restructuring as the years and months progress.
Yeah. Okay, Dan, I'd love to come over to you now in the US, and I realise that here we're switching from relatively homogenous system. I say relatively, I suppose there is quite a lot of differentiation in the UK, but in the US, huge differentiation across the sector, which makes generalizations perhaps a little bit difficult. But could you give us a view from your own perspective in Pennsylvania of the biggest financial risks and challenges currently?
Sure. I think a lot of it's already been said. It's sort of a yes and. I mean, if you look historically back 50 or 60 years, and thanks, by the way, it's a pleasure to be here, and John and colleagues. If you look back 50 or 60 years, what's been happening is a secular decline or sort of divestment of state funding from higher education, public as well as private, federal as well as state dollars. And in some ways, that sort of divestment, sort of dollars per student FTE, was masked by this massive growth in student enrollment, right? Which we call it tidal wave 1, baby boomers, and tidal wave 2, which is the children of the baby boomers. And it sort of pushed enrollments to extraordinary highs, topping out at about 2010. And of course, so those divestments were masked to a certain extent by the fact that there were more dollars in the door because you had revenue growth as a consequence of enrollment. And of course, universities and colleges could grow their tuition best they could. So 2010, you get this turnaround, right, in the demographics, and of course the price gets to a point where it's no longer as affordable, and you see this pretty significant decline. And it turns out it's actually easier to add programs and add people and add services than it is to take those things away in light of new enrollment realities. So universities and colleges tend to be slow to shift in terms of their new revenue realities. And coupled with this, well-known demographic shifts, people stopped having babies quite as many babies in 2000 or so. And so you've got this decline in the high school leaving population, which is a traditional market. So, that puts enormous pressure on universities, and I think is driving a lot of the challenges that we're facing. I do want to sort of add a couple of other pressure points that I don't think are unique to the United States, but I'll throw them out there. And if they are, perhaps colleagues can chime in. So the demographic shift, the fact that the population of high school leavers, our traditional market, is declining, is also compounded by this sort of increasing urbanization of the United States, this shift of people out of rural areas. And if you think historically, universities and colleges often were planted in rural regions to provide local workforce needs, teachers and other other critical occupations. And of course, as those populations shift, they can no longer sustain those rural higher education, which is where a lot of the financial pressure is. You have this increasing skepticism about the return on investment available from a college degree. I think, and I think that's related to price. As price grows, you're asking a student to forego, even in a public university, $100,000 maybe for the price of a degree, and they're going to wait 4 years before they get a job. And yes, they'll probably see an uptick in their earning power, but it's an awful lot of money to put up front. When you can go to Target, and nothing against Target, but you can get a job for $20 an hour today as an 18-year-old. So, why would I go to college? And that skepticism is fueled by the fact that at least in the US, higher education is getting politicized as a result of some of the social issues. And so it's being attacked right and left, frankly, in ways that sort of, I think, fuel that kind of skepticism. And you see, both parties, you see this growing skepticism about the extent to which higher education is good for the nation. I don't think that's helping all that much. And finally, I think you see this employer ambivalence in their role in providing kind of technical training. They sometimes want to rely on higher education. They sometimes don't. They like to go back and forth, and I think that also has a role to play in dampening. Dampening demand for existing educational services.
Yeah, absolutely. That return, that sort of value or return on investment point is one that's live everywhere, I think, as is the political angst. We'll come on to that perhaps. I would like to just return, if I could. I mean, you talked about tidal waves of growth. A tidal wave of growth for many parts of the world, certainly UK, Australia and Canada. Australia in particular, it's a shame there's no one specifically from Australia on this call, is international student enrolment, which has become the crutch on which so many slightly sickly HE funding systems have lent over the last 5 to 10 years. COVID was mentioned earlier, and of course COVID in a way showed what a shaky foundation it was to build, the financial strength of your system on international flows. And yet, if you look at Australia, largely there seems to have been a return to the old ways of doing things. Would any of you like to take that one on in particular and address, perhaps within the geopolitical context with relations with China cooling, how dangerous is it for universities to continue to rely on, and governments to continue to rely on, that international student revenue as such a core part of the way our universities pay the bills? You can go to any of you. I mean, Matt, it's something that's addressed in the report, or Susan, if you'd like to come in on that, Susan.
Maybe Matt go, and then I'll go.
I think international students is an important part of the global HE landscape, and so it's not a problem that we have large numbers of international students, even if you can end up with concentration risks in certain subjects and so on. So after all, it's one of the kind of clearest value exchanges you can imagine. A UK university benefits from lots and lots of very smart students from all around the world, and those students return with a world-class education and go on to fuel their own economic and personal growth. So on its own, I think we should always remember it's a good thing. Against that, if you have built a system that only works with material numbers of international students, and you then apply quite variable immigration policy to that, then you are creating enormous weakness in the system. So I think, a little bit back to Diana's earlier point, if you want to have a system that depends on international students, that's great. Then you need a consistently liberal and welcoming immigration regime. And if you don't want to have a consistently liberal and welcoming immigration regime, then the domestic market has to fund itself.
Mm-hmm.
So I used to work at a business school here in New York City, that was very much had a global reputation, and I did admissions, and we really thought we had just an unlimited pipeline of international students, particularly from China, from India, that, you know, they could fill any seat. If we ever had a problem, it was just, you know, money coming in and we would be fine. And that has proved not to be true, not necessarily for anything the school has done, but just from the global climate. You know, here in the US, international numbers have picked up, but they're not back to where they were at the height of, you know, the height of international student population here. And what I'm seeing more and more in institutions that we work with, and again, like not this top tier of places, but in the tiers, you know, middle and the most challenged places, is that because they do not have a global reputation, they have to work much harder to recruit international students and to basically like set up a pipeline that does work. And a lot of it is relationship based, and you can end up with students coming from a certain pocket. So from a certain, you know, very specific area in India, for instance, and if the visa process gets jammed up in that area, or something goes sideways in some other way, literally all of the sudden, all of the students, you know, not all, but let's say at least half of the students in a specific master's program that the university or college counted on for a specific amount of revenue just evaporates, like immediately evaporates. And sometimes that can be fixed and sometimes that can't. And so I think this just, you know, reinforces what what Matt was saying, was that if you are going to be dependent on it, you really need to be careful and make sure that there's diversity in your pipeline, and that you have strategies to, you know, shift from one place to another if something gets jammed up.
Absolutely, yeah. And in the UK here, the big debate now is around dependents, students from particular countries coming and bringing dependents with them, and that becoming politically difficult for universities as well.
Can I maybe offer another? And you know, basically, when you look at it, international students, it's part of a broader high fees, high aid model. You bring in students who can pay the full rate of tuition so that you can subsidize students who can't. So if you look at that from a workforce perspective, right? In the United States, 65% of all jobs today require somebody in them with some form of higher education. About 51% of the adult population has that. That's a huge gap. The only way to fill that gap is to do better with low and middle income students who have been historically underserved by universities and colleges. So if you do the math on that high fees, there are not enough wealthy people left to subsidize the number of low and middle income people that need to get to and through. So that while the conversation is important in terms of diversity of population, in terms of sort of sustaining universities financially, it's a very difficult conversation to have from a public policy perspective if one role of higher education is to provide a nation with the workforce it needs in order to be competitive.
Yeah, absolutely. We could talk about, I think, international students all day, but there's so many issues to move on to. I do want to, in a moment, move on to more specifically what steps universities are taking to improve their financial position. But before I do want to talk about cost pressures too. You know, inflation, cost of living crisis is leading to salary demands, pension disputes. We're also in an era or perhaps coming to the end of an era of big capital projects, estates projects colliding with a new era when online investment is perhaps more relevant and needed. What are the biggest concerns from a cost perspective? Would one of you like to address that? Diana, should we come to you on that one?
I was itching to come in on the last question, actually, but I'll answer this one. So I suppose in a past life, I wrote the first HEPI report, Higher Education Policy Institute, looking at demand for higher education in England specifically. And at the time, which was pre-pandemic, I was going around to different universities saying, build, build, build. You've got this massive boom coming. It just seems so logical. I didn't see the pandemic coming. I didn't see the transition to online coming. So I think the narrative still remains the same. If we're going to expand, we've got to have the capacity to do so. But that doesn't now need to be in terms of physical infrastructure. Of course, we need accommodation. Of course, we need the lecture halls. But if we're going to embrace the hybrid world and get in the diversity of students, which the other speakers have just spoken about, we need to be upping our capacity in digital space as well, and all those other mediums by which students can study. But that isn't cheap. It's like a chicken and egg situation. Sometimes you need the students first to be able to get the money to do the technology, not the other way around. And I can see Dan nodding as a university leader there who probably knows more about it. So I think we're yet to square that circle, but I think we definitely do need that investment to be able to move forward.
Dan, I mean, should we come to you on that? Digital's, of course, a big part of the story here. And I wonder how easy is it as a university leader to transition from a cost base that's primarily focused on physical estate, physical delivery of education, to that investment instead in digital delivery?
Yeah, no, it's challenging. And the report puts it brilliantly. You need financial wherewithal in order to make the investments to stay current. And you need to make it, but you don't have it, but you need to make those investments to stay current, to sort of sustain. I mean, so I think that's a problem. And it's exacerbated by the fact that, when you invest in residential style of education, you see this enrollment decline for all the reasons we've spoken about, then you're saddled with debt service, which you don't have enough students in beds or, having a cafeteria style dining in order to recoup. So universities that I'm familiar with, and we're talking again, not about the elite sector that are struggling, are using what we call education in general expenditure, the money you use to sort of drive the educational aspect of the business, to subsidize the debt service, which isn't being paid, so it turns into a vicious cycle, which begins to sort of, further encroach on the kind of investment funding that might otherwise be used to stay current. It's a massive challenge. The footprint is not too big. We actually have to educate more people, to Diana's point. The footprint is just oriented to the wrong group and has a lot of sunk cost, which have to be paid.
Something that does, I would say, it's an area of concern and something to watch, right? I talk with lots and lots of places, and I hear things that are very similar in how to bring in revenue, and some of that. And these are places that need to bring in revenue, right? That this challenge group that we're talking about, and looking to greater enrollment at the graduate level, bringing in adult learners, people who started a degree and didn't complete it, things that we do need that as a country, as a world, that we do want to do, right? The college degree doesn't do you a great amount of good if you don't finish it or get to a point where you've learned something that's really differentiating you in the marketplace. But looking to say, okay, we're going to do online programs. We're going to do, certain master's degree programs. Certainly in the US, we have a desperate need for nurses. We'll do some nursing programs. And we hear that at lots and lots of places. And, there used to be a handful of places, and some of them are mentioned in your report, that already had really established a very strong and broad reputation in the market for delivering online education, right? Already had platforms built. Now, pretty much everybody can do that. And while there is a need to do that, everybody can't win at this. And if you have, 8 small places in a, certain region, all trying to provide the same thing that is needed in that region, they still can't all win, So it's going to be hard to find a way to succeed and to beat the competition in some of these areas, even when what's being offered is something that is needed.
Yeah, I mean, if everybody can't win, what are we talking about there? I mean, are there sort of economies of scale where more partnership is part of the answer? Are we looking? I mean, in the US, you can hardly look at the education press in the US in a given day or week and not see the closure of some usually relatively small institution or mergers. Are there sort of, do mergers work, for example? Is that part of the answer here, or does that tend to be the case of a weak swimmer rescuing a drowning man, rather than someone from a position of strength bringing together something that's greater than the sum of its parts? Have you got any view on that, Susan?
Yes, I mean, sometimes it can work. I've seen some larger, like some strong swimmers, right, rescue some weak swimmers that had something unique to offer, right? Whether that was a campus in an attractive location, some programs that added value, some money that brought, you know, a nice endowment for, even if it was some for a specific area and didn't just be spent generally. But I also have had university presidents, and Dan may be able to speak to this too, say, you know, we've been approached by 3 institutions this year asking us if we would be interested in a merger, an affiliation, a takeover. And we have said no to all of them because none of them are offering anything that, you know, we don't already have. And maybe they're coming with debt that we don't want. You know, maybe they do have a campus, but it's not a campus that we can leverage in any way. We can't monetize it because the land can't be repurposed easily. We can't, we don't need an extra campus. They haven't taken care of their campus, and there's a lot of deferred maintenance. You know, there are a lot of issues. I'm not saying it can't succeed, but because they, you know, there have been some that have, but it's hard. And we just had one fall apart this week in the US where, you know, I've been working on a research piece, and when I started the piece, this had just happened, and now I've got to change what I wrote. You know, it already hasn't worked out.
Yeah. On the, I mean, if we sort of just take a step back from some of the specifics there and just think about the sort of what the university leaders can do to put themselves in the strongest financial position, given the range of challenges they're facing, are there some sort of short-term and perhaps some longer-term actions that universities leaders are and should be taking at the moment? Dan, have you got a sort of any advice on the sort of the key things that should be under consideration?
It's a big question, isn't it? I mean, I'm trying to think of the London context, as we're pretty lucky. If you run an institution in London, you might not think so, but you've got lots of levers which you can pull. You haven't just got the national government, in our case, Westminster government. It's higher education in England, or funds it, should I say, not regulates it. But you've got the GLA, you've got the different boroughs, and you've got sub-regional groups as well, each of which should be thought of as a lever which you can pull if you want to get some influence. And particularly the sub-regional groups could see you coming together with 7 or 8 different institutions in that region. So you've got collective clout, and that could be used not just in terms of political influence, but also procurement as well. So you're working with local businesses to get local goods and local services, but also you can use them to spin out your innovation and your research as well, and hopefully create a multiplier movement across the region, then across the nation as well. So I would say don't underestimate the power of the region that you're in. And I know that's London, that's special, but that could work on a larger scale wherever you are in the country or indeed in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Dan, would you like to come in on that as well?
Yeah, I just actually build directly on it. I would just push that sort of shared service analogy. I push it into the front office as well, right? So what about shared programming? And you can do that across wide area regions, particularly important for, you know, underpopulated schools who, you know, as they begin to shrink their enrollments, have to no choice but to cut programs, which then curtails choice, which then might shrink enrollments further. So one way to address that is to do a kind of shared programming. And you can think of a course carousel model where, you know, a number of institutions are offering courses to students. You know, think of it as an Uber sharing app where, you know, I need a course, one comes along and picks you up and takes you to your degree destination. And you can think of ways of doing that so that the courses are only offered on, that if you have 2 comparable courses, one is offered until it is full, right? So you have course section sizes which are sustainably, you know, enrolled before the next one gets released. So you can think of wholly new models of expanding breadth of academic opportunity for students. Of course, it leverages digital technology, but does it in a massively more efficient ways. And of course, begins to address some of the pricing issues involved in very expensive faculty, whether they're nurse practitioners or data mining, data scientists, you know, who are otherwise accountants even, can be very difficult to find at an affordable price. So you could begin to think about sharing very scarce expertise in ways which make it more effective to employ. But that's going to require some significant, and to the question that was asked in the chat, that's a radical transformation. If you think about, you know, the whole sort of ethos, the mindset of the organizational enterprise is we're going to build everything here and we're going to own it, right? And now all of a sudden, that's not quite the case in this new kind of shared programming world.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, we in the final third of our hour together, maybe we will move on to that question of how radical universities should and perhaps can be in this regard. I mean, Matt, you and colleagues who worked on the report have come up with some pretty concrete ideas about how bold universities might be in addressing specific aspects of the change that they're facing at the moment. Would you be able to talk us through those, and we can perhaps use that as the basis for the final section of our conversation?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So apologies for those who can't hear me. I'm hoping the audio is okay. We basically identified 4 areas in which universities need to consider, so not have to do everything, but need to consider how to improve their financial sustainability. The first is just strategic distinctiveness. I mean, markets force people to be good at something, and universities are too typically okay at everything. And so that means specializing in some way. It might be specializing around the type of student that you want to serve. It might be specializing on the geography in which you're located. It might be specializing on subject, but you're going to need to be world class at something. And that means not investing in stuff you're not good at. That's the painful bit. The easy bit is, oh, we'd like to be world class at this. The hard thing is to disinvest in things that you're not that good at. And there are all kinds of reasons why universities don't like doing that, and we can explore that. But fundamentally, strategic distinctiveness is absolutely essential in a market-based environment. Second, which we've already alluded to here, is capturing the benefits of scale. It could be shared services. The record of that, at least in the UK, is very poor, mostly because there are no buyers of shared services. So you're having a one-dimensional market in which people are offering their services, but nobody wants to buy them. And so for me, mergers, shared governance, multi-university groups or trusts with common shared services where you can take economies of scale is going to be extremely important for some institutions. And it's particularly important in the UK, where universities are generally subscale relative to either their Australian counterparts or larger state systems in the US, where they're able to capture, and where they do capture the benefits of scale. Just to give you a sense of the scale here, typically you can think of saving about half the cost of the smaller back office in a merger, alongside all the revenue synergies that Dan alluded to. You just think just simply about kind of what's the recoverable cost. So for $200-300 million revenue institutions, the cost saving is more than $50 million a year, which is the kind of money that universities can't otherwise access most of the time. That's the second pillar. The third is digital tech, as we've discussed. There's an awful lot here. This is one of those cases where they're saying, the future is here, it's just unevenly distributed, really holds true. You can look at what particularly Australia is doing around digital campus, and they're a long way ahead of most other university systems. Obviously, in the US, online learning is very, very deeply penetrated, and it's BAU, where you can still find universities in the UK and elsewhere who are thinking, should we do this? It's like, yes, you should do this. Yeah, that's not really a discussion anymore. And then the fourth thing is the change capacity. Back to your question, can universities do this? And the answer is yes, they can. As Susan said, when you hit the sector with something as dramatic as COVID, it can respond. What you want, though, is to be changing without that level of burning platform, because back to Dan's earlier point, the earlier you do this, the less radical you have to be in order to do this. So those are the 4 elements. There's a range of kind of ideas underneath that, but I'll stop there and pick them up as the conversation progresses.
Would any of the other panelists like to come in on that? I could bring in a question from the audience. Why don't I do that? Stacia Elliott says, in terms of this question of being radical, it can't just be about moving courses online. I think we'd all agree with that. Faculty can innovate, sure, but what about the large bureaucracy that seems entrenched, old systems, etc., impacting financial sustainability? I mean, that's less about sort of culture and will to change, isn't it? And more just about the sort of, I don't know, the way that university, there's the sort of legacy ways of doing things, and how do you, as a university leader, sort of start to break that down and force the issue if you do take the view that you need to achieve strategic distinctiveness and do something that's radically different in 5 years' time from what the university is today? What's the sort of best way to go about that? I wonder if I could ask Dan, as somebody who's perhaps directly got your hands on those levers as a university leader.
Sure. I mean, our university's now 10. We integrated 6 into 2. Started with 14 when I got here in 2018. They're facing a range of all the challenges that we've talked about. A number of them were really at a point of very severe financial weakness. We drove behavior change, or the board drove behavior change by putting in place a range of policies that required financially sustainable operations. It wasn't, and the tools and the incentives and disincentives to execute. It's one thing to say, you shall be sustainable. It's another thing to actually put in place the tools, incentives, disincentives, and then have the will on the board to implement them. If you need to drive that, then of course what that does is it sort of identifies the fact that your management, your administration may not be current. I mean, faculty may not be current. It's one thing to go to someone who's great at enrollment management, has been doing it for years and getting students out of high school and say, hey, we need to grow our adult population. You're like, there aren't any adults in secondary school. So where do they? So how do you invest? And you could say the same, you could have that same conversation about financial aid and career coaching and frankly, instruction, how to do sort of a proactive sort of active instruction to deal with much more diverse populations. It's just different worlds to land educational outcomes effectively with a multitude of different populations. How do you invest in your people in order to ensure that they remain current? So I think of this as ultimately it's a people business. And it's one thing to talk about investment in technology, et cetera. You have to invest in your people. You can't just go to folks and say, hey, could you be more culturally competent? Or hey, could you just go figure out how to recruit adults? You have to provide that scaffolding. And it goes back to that, I think, elegant, and frightening comment in the report about, you need to have money in order to make these investments at a time when universities are often. So I think about, yes, we can be radical and innovative, but only if we invest in our folks. And it's a professional development at tremendous scale, in my view.
Diana.
Can I just add to that as well? Because I think that's absolutely spot on, but it's about investing in people tomorrow, not just today. And I think this is, to use Dan's phrase of scaffolding, I think there's a couple of hooks that we could latch onto, one of which is the equality, diversity and inclusion agenda, something that we're really tuned into in London to make sure that we are as reflective as the society, diverse as a society around us. We cannot be progressive if we go on in our sort of traditional ways, very much white heavy at the moment, which it can't be like that. And the other one would be the net zero sustainability agenda as well. We know that the students of the future are thinking about this. We know that they're going to be judging us on this. Again, it costs money. I'm not saying there's a quick fix, but we need to show that we are living our values and we're living the values of the future as well. And I think that's ultimately what our success will be judged on.
Let me stay on the people question. We talked quite a lot about other things, infrastructure, digital. But of course, you're right. Universities are not really collections of buildings or anything else. It's communities of people that make a university. And do you think we are striking the right balance at the moment between efficiency and structuring organisations for the future, restructuring them, dare I say, and maintaining engagement and quality and treating staff fairly? Is there sort of something to be said about that as a financial sustainability issue? Because your university is your people, then they have to be treated in the right way. And it does strike me that universities are not particularly happy places at the moment in terms of the sort of staffing question. Dan, shall
I don't think we're striking the right balance. I mean, I think we're focusing more on efficiency than we ought to be. I like to think in my practice that what we're doing, I try to put everything in terms of student outcomes. And then you think about the people who drive the student outcomes, and then you make the investment in order to achieve that. The challenge in order to make the investments it goes to Matt's point, in order to make the investments in the people and the programs and the services that you need to be successful. If your students are successful, the institution will be successful financially. And if your students and your in order to make those investments, you probably have to curtail activity so you're not operating over such a broad waterfront. And that is super hard to do. It is much easier to add stuff than to take stuff away. Yep. And unfortunately, taking stuff away is the only way to drive reallocation of funding of dollars in our case, in a world where revenues are, from whether they're fed from public sector or from student enrollments are very hard to come by.
Mm-hmm. We have some questions coming in from the audience, which is great. Let's take a couple of them. Deborah Johnston asks, are any of the initiatives around modular or lifelong learning likely to create new opportunities for sustainability? Obviously very hot agendas in many countries. Are these going to be useful to universities from a financial sustainability perspective? Matt, would you like to come in on that one?
Sure, yeah. I think I'd separate the two things here. Modular and lifelong learning are quite different things. The lifelong learning market in most countries is not a great one. Like, that's just a statement of fact. And the reason for that is just a couple of years after graduation, employers care much more about what your employer experience is than your subsequent credentials. They're general statements. There are, boot camps, bits of IT, bits of tech where that's not true. But fundamentally, lifelong learning is not, in my view, in any market that I have seen, going to move the dial in. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. But if you're betting on that for your financial sustainability, it's extremely unlikely that it's going to get you there. And you can find maybe one or two institutions in the world that are really based on kind of top-up short courses for mature students. Modular learning, however, absolutely. I mean, one of the great advantages of being able to get digital content is that you can package it in modular ways. You can use different bits of it in different places. You can have high-quality multimedia stuff that you can learn asynchronously, which students can access, that allows them to access new students. So if you think, should I modularize learning? Yes, there are good reasons for wanting to do that. Maybe not for everybody, but for many people, lifelong learning, not so sure about.
Okay, thank you very much. Another question from an unnamed attendee. What are the possibilities of new or innovative revenue streams for universities? Any sort of greenfield sites that are out there waiting to be grazed? Anyone got any thoughts on that? Matt, you look like you're...
I'm happy to comment on that. If you look at what the private sector is doing, the answer is yes. Yeah, I mean, there's a private university in Germany, mostly teaching mature students, not lifelong learning, but just mature students and graduates, that's making 100 million euros of surplus, which is pretty much more than the UK system generates. And it didn't exist 10 years ago. So yes, absolutely there are. But to access them, you need to work on the core first. If you just try to access that now, you're structurally too high cost, you're not nimble enough, your governance processes won't go there. And so there are definitely new and innovative revenue streams, but most of them require a set of commercial skills that you don't necessarily have. If you're in a very strong position, you've got a strong brand, you're world-class, you're well-known for something, it's very easy to spin off new revenue streams. I mean, if somebody said to me, could you think of new revenue streams for Johns Hopkins University, but like shooting fish in a barrel? But for most universities, there's work to do on a core to get the commercial agility first.
Mm-hmm. And we haven't talked much about research. Clearly, a huge part of what universities do, also a huge part of what makes them distinctive. And of course, commercialization of research is an area that's always being pushed. Is that also an area that really is the preserve of the elite, or is it something that universities at every level can make more a part of their sort of financial sustainability if they think about it in the right way? I mean, Diana, you represent universities from the very world top 10 research elites down to sort of institutions that are more serving London communities in a slightly different way. What's the sort of view from you on that?
I should have come in with this earlier, and I was itching to, because anybody who knows me will know that I always point out researchers as the Cinderella of the policy landscape, the people that always fall down the cracks. They're not necessarily classed students, even though they are students reading for masters or PhDs. And I think you see that particularly in the UK, the fact that we've got two different departments looking at science research and students. And when you alluded earlier to the potential clampdowns on international postgraduate students, I wish more people would be squaring that circle and going, well, that's just a pipeline of talent. If we want to become a science superpower, then we need to make sure we're building that pipeline and the people that can progress. But going to your wider point about is research a preserver of the elite? No, I don't think it is, because every university, even if they're teaching heavy or teaching intensive, for want of a better term, that teaching is almost always either practice-led or research-led teaching. And that is at the heart of what universities do. So I do think there's more that we could be doing to actually bring that out. It's not just about the research excellence framework here in the UK or elsewhere. It can come through in other ways, sort of bringing products to market, innovation, going out, working in businesses, actually giving those ideas across, and more business interaction. So maybe that is a way that universities could be more radical as well.
And the other area that's been mentioned a couple of times that universities can clearly look at in terms of rethinking what makes them distinctive and breaking out from the homogenous lump of everybody that tries to be all things to all people is around the course offering and rationalizing and rethinking course portfolios. Something I know colleagues at THE's consultancy team talk to universities about all the time. Is that something that universities should be looking at sort of as a matter of course, or is that something just to look at when you feel that you're running into trouble? You talked earlier, Matt, about Dan's quote about taking action before you perhaps need to take action. Is that something that should be being done just as a matter of course, just monitoring what your offer is, what your place in the market is?
Yes, absolutely. And most universities do, but what they tend to do, most universities essentially have a small number of surplus generating departments and a long tail of loss-making departments. And the typical practice of a university is to take money from the surplus generating departments and spread it into the loss-making departments. And that is a great solution while you want to be a university that has a broad course offering and you're financially sustainable. But the minute you're in trouble, and that's nearly everybody outside of the research elite now, you need to stop putting money into loss-making departments unless they're providing you with some other benefit that is essential to the mission of the institution. And it's that kind of critical look at what you're really good at and what you're not really good at that universities need to take with a degree of sort of brutality of intent that most universities don't have as part of BAU, and that I think is the difference.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we're coming to the end of our hour, so I'm going to leave you as a panel with one last easy question from an audience member, Maria Elena Rodriguez, who asks, can you comment on the challenges and opportunities that AI is bringing to the sector? Now, clearly, that could mean all sorts of things, but let's view that through the lens of financial sustainability. How do you see AI as affecting the financial health of the sector positively or negatively in the years ahead? Anyone brave enough to take that one on? I mean, is it something that you're lying awake worrying about at night, Dan?
I'm excited. I mean, I think you talk about AI in terms of sort of student plagiarism, okay, but I think the opportunities are, you can imagine throwing AI at, student and financial data to identify universities at risk way before they're seriously at risk, and identifying sort of possible trajectories, or using AI to throw at student outcomes data, student unit record data, to identify sort of patterns where student stopouts are happening in order to think about what are the interventions to stop students from stopping out. Both of those things will, I think, improve financial sustainability, and both are within the current capabilities of AI.
Great. Anyone else care to comment on that? Matt?
Look, just a bit. First of all, I think it's right to be excited about it. If universities are not excited about what AI and machine learning can do for society, then who is going to be excited? It's literally the brain's trust of the nation. So I think that's the right mindset to approach this with. As with any technology advance, you can do really cool things with it if you're embracing it and you work with it. So the things that Dan just described, as you say, are kind of well within the capabilities. But one of the interesting things for me is universities have always struggled to articulate the value of their degree to employers because they can't really talk about teamwork. But actually, lots and lots of online interactions now are studyable by AI. You could be giving students feedback saying, okay, the majority of your interaction with other people are positive, they get good response. All of that automated feedback could be now feeding into students, telling them how they're interacting with other people and so on and so forth. And that could form part of an objective transcript that would follow. And so, pedagogy could change in quite material ways over time. I don't want to prescribe what that would be, because academics are right in the cold face and they do it. But there's no reason why AI should damage the financial sustainability of universities. And if they embrace it, there's no reason why it should improve it.
Okay. Well, look, we're out of time, but that was a fascinating conversation. Covered a huge amount of ground, but probably barely scraped the surface of all the detailed analysis that's in the report itself. So we will be providing that to all the participants of the webinar, all of the audience members today. But panel, thank you so much for joining me, and indeed audience too. Thank you very much.